Board. You can just hit got it. We're good. Um, I would like to thank Dr. Weinberg for being here tonight. We are Caring Kind, one of the oldest and long-running nonprofit community-based organizations in Manhattan. We serve a wide variety of individuals with early stage caregiver support, support groups, access to legal, financial, educational, wander safety, connect to culture, um, a host of really good programs, education, information, resource, one-stop shopping, or your trusted partner. Rochelle, if you can put our helpline number in the chat, that would be great. If you want to reach us, that's a way to reach us. But I have the distinct privilege to introduce Dr. Ken Weinberg to you tonight. He's a three-time board-certified emergency room medicine and medical marijuana physician. After finishing a residency in internal medicine, Dr. Weinberg created a fellowship in psychoneuroimmunology at Manhattan VA, then trained in emergency medicine at Bellevue and New York, NYU Langone. He has practiced emergency and urgent care medicine for over 3 decades. When New York State's Compassionate Care Act was passed in January of 2016, he founded Cannabis Doctors of New York. The practice, which is based in New York City, upstate certifies patients, educates the public, and advocates for many benefits of medical marijuana. The advocacy, education, as well as cannabis research are also carried out in his role as a member of the Medicinal Cannabis Work Group of Northwell Health. Dr. Weinberg has treated hundreds of patients with diseases across the spectrum of conditions. He is a cannabis advocate and emerging thought leader who has lectured on the benefits of cannabis throughout the state, met with elected officials to promote its use, and been featured in various publications and on television. In addition, he is a published writer with a blog, Bedside Manners, on Psychology Today. Dr. Weinberg, welcome, and I'm going to turn this over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. So let's see, where do I begin? I guess that really gives my background. I've been doing cannabis medicine since 2016 when the state legalized it, and probably seen close to 1,500 patients at this point with a variety of diseases, and increasingly seeing patients with dementia, which is why we're having this talk. So let's start. We can move to the next slide. Okay. So whenever I give a talk about cannabis, I really think it's important to give a sense of the history of the plant. And you can go on to the next slide. And, this slide has a lot of information in it, but it's really not important, the details. What I think is important to know is that maybe for 10,000 years, there have been references to cannabis in Chinese medicine, in India. I think we've evolved with the plant. And I'll say more about that later. But I think, the things of note are that it has so many benefits that it really makes sense to me at this point that when I see my patients with a variety of disease states, how well it works for the majority of them. And in addition to the medicinal benefits, there are other benefits as well from the plant, from the cannabis and hemp plants, which I'll show a little later. But Carl Sagan, who I'm sure most of you know, who is a major proponent of cannabis, actually said that he thought that it took us from being hunter-gatherers, a hunter-gatherer society, to an agrarian society, because it did have so many benefits, and you couldn't be out in the plains running after capturing or being chased. You had to stay in one place so you could actually plant the seeds help the plant grow, harvest it, and then take advantage of all the benefits that it had. One other historic note from long ago I will mention is that I came across something in my reading that supposedly, when the first temple was built in Jerusalem, God said to the priests they should be anointed with an oil made of cannabosum. Is that cannabis? I don't know. I think it's interesting, and I just throw it out there because, again, there are so many there's so many benefits to it, and I think that sort of illustrates that. Okay, now we can come closer to modern times with the next slide. I don't know if you'd be able to see these, but these are a bunch of bottles that we found that show that cannabis was part of it was part of the U.S. pharmacopoeia until 1937, basically. So that meant that the U.S. pharmacopoeia had decided cannabis was an actual medication, and it was part of many, many medicines, as illustrated in these slides. Go on to the next slide. So unfortunately, what happened in the 30s, William Randolph Hearst, who I'm sure everybody knows about, had was upset because he had vast tracts of forests that he wanted to use for wood pulp for his newspapers, and it turned out that pulp from hemp was much more uh, efficient and could be used much easier, and so he felt threatened by that. At the same time, DuPont had just come out with nylon. They wanted to make nylon rope. They were trying to sell nylon rope. Hemp rope had been around for centuries. It was very, very effective, cheaper than nylon. They conspired. This was when the Federal Bureau of Narcotics was started. Harry Anslinger was appointed the head. It just happens, coincidentally, that he was related to the DuPonts, and they started demonizing cannabis. They started calling it marijuana so that it could be associated with people of color and demonized. Um, I have a reference there to the movie Reefer Madness, which I think was one of the best propaganda films of all time. If anybody has not seen it, it's worth seeing. It's so outrageous. And one of the things they talk about in that movie is they call it the killer weed, which I find very funny because, as we know, cannabis has never led to an overdose in the 5,000 or so years that we've known about it. Anyway, moving up into closer to the present time and leading to the state that we're in now, oops, you can go back. You're stealing my thunder there with that letter. Nixon was very concerned because people of my generation were all smoking weed, or roofer, as he called it. And he appointed a commission. He thought they would say that should be made illegal. Instead, they said, no, legalize it. This is when the DEA came out and the scheduling of drugs, and cannabis was made a Schedule I narcotic, along with heroin and various psychedelics. And Schedule I narcotics are apparent or supposedly drugs that have very little, if any, medicinal properties and very high addiction potential, which all of us know isn't true, but that's where it's been. And for the last 50 years, leading to so many people being put in jail. I mean, all of the horrible consequences of that decision, in addition to the fact, and I know this personally, being on that medical cannabis research group, to get a Schedule I narcotics license and to be able to do research is almost impossible. The hoops that you go through are real and make it so difficult to do any research, which makes it difficult for us when I talk to my colleagues for me to be able to say, oh, we have all these studies. We have some studies, but not a lot. And a lot of the studies that have been done were done overseas or in Canada. Just to give you a little more information, as an emergency physician, I had a Schedule 2 through 5 narcotics license. I could prescribe cocaine for you. I could prescribe opiates. I could prescribe amphetamine, but I couldn't prescribe and can't prescribe marijuana And the only way that New York State has gotten around that is I will write a recommendation when someone comes to me to get cannabis. And then when they go to the pharmacy, to the dispensary, the pharmacist will actually prescribe it for them. And this brings me to the next slide, which is I've been working with Kirsten Gillibrand, our senator. In fact, I saw her at a fundraiser in the summer and told her about all that we've been doing with cannabis and dementia, which she was very happy to hear about. She wound up writing to the Attorney General, to Merrick Garland, in this letter, which you don't have to read it, but basically what she said was, I suggest that you make a recommendation that this be brought down to a Schedule 3 narcotic, which is in a class with like Tylenol with codeine or ketamine, things like that, much less addictive potential and much more reasonable, and would allow us to do the research. It would just make it so much easier. So I really, I'm giving a shout out to Kirsten for having done that. I think it's great. Okay, now we can move on. So this is the plant. And looking at this plant, this cannabis and hemp, basically the same thing. You wouldn't be able to tell the difference from looking at the flowers, the smell, anything. The only real distinction is that hemp has to have less than 0.3% THC. Just a stupid kind of bureaucratic decision that was made. But they both have all of these properties. Pliny the Elder in 100 AD talked about using the roots for joint inflammation. In the present day, there's a lot of companies that have now been using this for building materials, the stems, the leaves for juicing. The parchment that our Declaration of Independence was written on was hemp parchment. The seeds have many, many uses going back to that Chinese emperor in 2000 BC. And then the flowers, which is really where they have the majority of the THC and the other cannabinoids in them, certainly have the medicinal qualities. But I think it's important to be aware of the spiritual qualities and the pleasurable qualities of it. And I'll just give an interesting example. I have a patient who has Crohn's disease. He's a Hasidic Jew. His Rebbe told him it was okay to use cannabis. It was kosher. After a couple of months of him using it, we had a conversation. And he said, Dr. Weinberg, does THC give you wisdom? And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, I've been reading Talmud all my life. And there have been portions of it that I have never been able to understand. But when I'm using my THC for my Crohn's, I have insights into what they mean. I understand it so much better. And it's not because I'm high, because I've spoken to my Rebbe about it. I've spoken to my wife. I've really just had these wonderful insights from using THC. So I just throw that out there because I thought that was fascinating and a lovely story. Okay, we can move on. So the plant has hundreds of different chemicals, 100 cannabinoids, and I'll show you the major ones. Everybody knows about THC and CBD. Those are the most prominent ones, but there's CBN, CBG, all of which have very different properties. Also, I'll mention the terpenes, which, fortunately, New York State is talking a lot more about, because the terpenes not only give it the smell, but they also have a lot to do with the benefits and the properties that accrue when you're using them with THC and CBD. And just to give you an example of terpenes, if you walk through a pine forest, you're smelling pinene. Pinene is used in pine sol. If you cut a lemon, you're going to smell limonene, another terpene. So those terpenes are very important in terms of the actual benefits that you get. Okay, we can move on. So THC and CBD, these are the major, the most prominent chemicals in the plant. And if you go on to the next one, I'll show you what THC looks like and talk about that. So THC is known for its psychoactive effects. It's what gets you high. The nice thing about the medical program is that you have total control and precision in terms of what you're getting. And one of the first things that my patients will say to me is when they're starting using medical cannabis is, I don't want to get high, doctor. And I assure them that they won't, because you can really start with very low doses. You always want some THC and CBD together. They really help each other out. And CBD will often mitigate some of the bad or psychoactive effects that people get. But in any case, I think it's really I like to downplay the psychoactive properties because you really do have total control, and more importantly, because THC is a great pain reliever. It's very good for that. It's very good for insomnia. It also, I have a lot of patients who use it for appetite stimulation. I get a lot of patients from Sloan Kettering who have nausea after their chemotherapy, neuropathy. It's helpful for that. And I'll just say, and I hope this isn't going too far out, but if you look at the chemical formula of THC there, you see there are these structures, these ring structures. All of the cannabinoids have that. The only difference is that there'll be little chemicals off of those structures, which again, THC, CBG, CBN, they'll all look a little bit differently because of those chemicals, and that will give them a different property. And the other thing that I want to mention, if you look at the end, there's a tail coming off of that, which all of them have. And I'm fascinated by that because this is a plant cannabinoid, a phytocannabinoid. It's a cannabinoid that comes from the cannabis plant. We make our own cannabinoids in our brain, endocannabinoids. They also have that same tail on them. And I think we've evolved with the plant. I think that's why it is so effective. And if you think about any of again, I hope this isn't going too far, but I think as a doctor, I'm really interested in dopamine and serotonin, endorphins. All of those neurotransmission systems are like a lock and key. There's a specific chemical that goes to a receptor, and because of its structure, like you see on this THC, it goes into that specific receptor. And I think the fact that the cannabinoids in the plant and the cannabinoids that we make are so similar, and you have that same lock and key phenomenon, makes me believe that we have evolved over millennium with the plant. I'm just throwing it out there. I think it's interesting. It's speculative, but I think it also explains why it works so well for so many different medical problems. Okay, we can go on to the next one. So here's CBD. Again, that same kind of structure with that tail on it. CBD is tremendous for inflammation. I have a lot of patients with autoimmune diseases who do so well because it has tremendous anti-inflammatory properties. And when we talk about dementia, which I'll do in a couple of minutes, a lot of the problems that are going on in dementia are caused by inflammation, cytotoxicity, cell death. CBD is really, really helpful in preventing that. This work that's being done with people who have traumatic brain injury, who are being given high CBD doses, it's very helpful there. It's also, and again, this relates especially to the patients with cognitive issues, it's a great anxiolytic. It helps get rid of anxiety. And as I'll discuss later, a lot of the behavioral issues that go on with our dementia patients are because of anxiety. So the CBD component is very, very helpful. And it's also a great analgesic. It helps. It's not as strong a pain reliever as THC, but it certainly has pain relieving effects. Okay, so let's move on to the next one. Now, again, a lot going on in this slide, but I think it's just important to know why this works. And our endocannabinoid system. And I'll tell you, it's funny. One of the reasons that I've been having my conversations with Senator Gillibrand and her people is because I discovered not that long ago that maybe 10% of all medical schools teach about the endocannabinoid system. 10%. So all these physicians, all my colleagues are out there. And when I try to talk to them about cannabis, they really don't know anything. They never learned about it in medical school. And it's really the master system. Just to give you a little history, nobody until 1964 knew what the active component of cannabis was. And there's a biochemist who just died recently, Raphael Meshulam, an Israeli biochemist. He had a friend who worked in the Tel Aviv jail. He went to the jail. The guy gave him 2 pounds of Lebanese hash, which he took on a bus back to his office. And he was able to discover that THC was the active component in the plant. So then we knew, okay, this is why the effects are caused. It's by THC to begin with. It took 30 years to discover that we actually made our own endocannabinoids. And then the question was, well, if we make endocannabinoids, do we have receptors for them? So there was a PET scan that was done looking at the brain. The brain lit up so diffusely that people thought it was a false positive. They could not believe that there were so many receptors in the brain for cannabis, but it, in fact, is the master system, and it was not a false positive. So I just mention all that because, again, it's why I am constantly impressed by how well this works for people in so many different conditions, and this, I think, explains it. Okay, we can move on to the next. And I just wanted to say something about the dosing and the medical program because these questions often come up. What's really nice, one of the things that I do approve of, and New York State has screwed this up badly, I have to say, but one of the things that is good about it is that New York State is one of the few states of the 38 that have legalized medical cannabis to require that you go to a pharmacist. And so before anybody is able to get medical cannabis, they have to sit and talk with the pharmacist. So as a physician, I really appreciate that. And I know that they have a lot of experience. And, you know, as I'll talk about later, there's so many issues with drug interactions. It's important to have a pharmacist on board. And again, as I say in this slide, you always want to start at the lowest dose, and you want to slowly work your way up. For some people, I've had patients who in one day have had positive benefits, and other people it can take days or weeks for the endocannabinoid system to really start to work. But you always are going to start at the lowest dose, especially in the elderly, and then just gradually work up to finding a sweet spot or sweet spots. Because many people come to me, not only do they have pain, they have insomnia, they have nausea. So they're often using more than one product. Okay, we can move on to the next. And again, this is just a note of caution. People always ask about this, and there are issues. Pregnant women, people who have a risk of having psychiatric, especially psychotic episodes, should probably not be using this. And then, you know, we have the drug interactions where cannabis can increase the levels of certain things, especially blood thinners, decrease the levels of others. So again, it's very, you know, it's very reassuring to me that I have people going in and seeing a pharmacist before they get started. Okay. So I'm sure most people know these statistics. We can move on to the next. And when I saw this quote, I felt it was really profound. I hadn't thought really that much about how memory really just holds us together, holds together who we are. And as we lose that, we lose our personhood. And it's totally understandable why anyone who is developing dementia, especially in the earlier stages when they're still very cognizant of things, is so upset and anxious and angry and all the behavioral manifestations they show because they're losing their memory, they're losing their selves. Okay. So, and these are the two areas that are most affected. I mentioned the frontal lobe because that's about executive function. It's about inhibiting impulses, and those are lost. And that's why we see so many of the impulsive, aggressive behaviors that a lot of patients with cognitive issues show. And then the hippocampus is also, because it's so involved with memory, gets hit very hard as well. So therefore, that causes the memory issues that patients with dementia have. Okay. So here are some of the causes, which probably most of you know. Um, and then the next slide. And I show these slides for two reasons. One is I just last week saw a study in the Lancet. Everybody knows HDL is the good cholesterol, but it turns out that if your HDL is too high, you may be at risk for developing dementia. So that was disturbing to see. But the other reason that I say this is because, and I will talk about this in a moment, I think that cannabis can help prevent the development of dementia. And we know that if you look at the brains of people who develop dementia later in life, 20 or more years prior to them actually having behavioral manifestations, there are changes going on in the brain. And I make the case that I think people should be, if you have any risk factors for developing dementia, I think there's a good reason to think that you should be using cannabis every day because it really should be able to help prevent the development or slow the onset. Again, this is somewhat controversial, but I'm throwing it out there because I think it's important for us to be aware of that possibility. Okay. So these are the actual processes that go on. The amyloid that develops into polymers that causes the plaques. The tau proteins that become embedded in the neurons. Again, I was talking about this before. Neuroinflammation. The nerve cells actually become inflamed. There's a loss of conductivity among the different neurons. The brain's immune cells, the microglia, start to eat up these brain cells. It's the way they react. Cytotoxicity is basically cell death. And then another thing that's important is acetylcholine is a major neurotransmission transmitter that is involved with cognition. And patients with dementia start lowering the levels of acetylcholine. So Aricept, in fact, is something that's supposed to prevent the breakdown of acetylcholine. Okay, we can go on to the next. So I think this is a really nice slide that just sort of symbolizes what is actually going on in the brain to show that, the neurons are just not connecting with each other as they should, and they start to die. The metabolism is affected as they get inflamed, and they're not able to repair themselves either. So I think these are all really important issues that when someone is looking at how to deal with this process, you want to be addressing all of these issues, which is, again, why I think, and I'll talk about in a second, why I think cannabis can be so helpful. Okay, you can go on to the next. So these are the symptoms that we all know about. Patients who we see who have dementia, what they develop, the loss of memory, the reasoning skills are down, loss of smell, which I think is interesting, and I'm not sure why that happens. The loss of appetite, they wander, depression, anxiety, agitation, the aggression, and the apathy, which is so disturbing, as well as insomnia. So those are the issues that we're all seeing in our patients who develop dementia. We can move on. So the treatments that are available now are the treatment of the neuropsychiatric symptoms. I mean, so many of these patients are on Seroquel, Haldol, antidepressants like Zoloft, benzodiazepines, and then medicine like Aricept, which are acetylcholinesterase, basically is the enzyme that breaks down acetylcholine. So if you can work on acetylcholinesterase, prevent it from working, technically you should keep your levels of acetylcholine up. Aricept, as we all know, doesn't work very well. Okay. And then we have the disease modifying treatments. Now, the only ones that I've been able to come across that are being used now are monoclonal antibodies, which do have some efficacy, and I can't really speak to them per se. I mean, the things that I read about, they seem to have some efficacy. It's unclear, and they're still, I think, somewhat controversial and experimental. On the other hand, cannabis, which I'll show you about in a moment, has many other properties that I think I would consider disease modifying, and I'll show that now. So as I mentioned before, CBD is great. It's neuroprotective. That anti-inflammatory ability of CBD is so important in preventing the development or the ongoing worsening of dementia. It's also, and we've seen this so much in our patients, that anxiolytic, that anti-anxiety effect. We're using, and I think this is a good place to just say, when people are getting medical cannabis, they're getting ratios of THC and CBD. You can get something that is a high THC, low CBD, equal amounts of THC and CBD, or a low THC and high CBD. And we're giving our dementia patients high CBD products because of that anxiolytic effect. And so many of them are more responsive. They are decreasing the amount of psychotropic meds they're taking. They're more interactive. THC works on acetylcholinesterase. It's much stronger than Aricept at preventing acetylcholinesterase from breaking down acetylcholine. So very strong reason I think we should be using THC products for our patients. And it also prevents the development of those neurofibrillary tangles, which are just invading the neurons and preventing neurotransmission. Also, there's work that shows that it can mold or actually affect the plasticity of the brain. There are studies that show, and I'll refer to them in a moment, certainly in mouse studies, where the plasticity of the brain is affected in a positive way, and connections are made that had not been there before, that had been destroyed. So these are all reasons, and I can talk about this more in the questions, but it's why I think I find cannabis to be such an exciting product for our patients with dementia. Okay, we can move on to the next. So studies, there are so many studies. You can go on to the next slide. I listed here some lab studies, and I'll just talk about them for a moment, and then clinical studies. But there are just a plethora of studies looking at this. The lab studies, obviously in mice and rats, they showed it was able to reverse memory deficits, reduce neural inflammation, and affect in a positive way neuroplasticity, and counteract the effects of the amyloid pathology. So that's very exciting. And, again, these are all referenced. I'm happy to share them if people want to see them. We can move on to the next one. And then here, whoops, back. Okay. again, there are so many studies, if you go to PubMed, but I listed 8 here. And and I can talk about the details, but basically, the first study it's interesting because it was using Marinol, that synthetic THC. This was in the 90s. There was a study early on, 30 years ago, which looked at Marinol, synthetic THC, and this was a placebo study, placebo-controlled study for 6 weeks, looked at 15 patients, and it really affected their aggressive behavior. The second study also was very helpful and showed it was very helpful in treating agitation. This was a review of many different studies: the nocturnal behavior disorders, aberrant vocalization, resting care. Then there was a third study. They were looking at the Cohn-Mansfield aggression inventory, and they showed this was a combination THC CBD oil. They showed that the behavioral issues were decreased by 40% after 2 months. Rigidity decreased by 50%. Half of the patients decreased or stopped their other psychotropic meds. And as important, the staff was very appreciative of it, as you can imagine. It made daily care much easier, transfers easier. They had improved contact with their patients. Also, in many of them, it decreased constipation. This was a Swiss study. The fourth one, again, was another review, observational studies that showed promising results with people whose symptoms were refractory. And they found that the safety profile was very favorable. The fifth study, this was an Israeli study that just came out last year. Again, 60 patients using the Cohn-Mansfield agitation inventory, significantly reduced agitation, no serious side effects. And again, caregivers were very, very happy about, the benefits. I'll just mention one other one, which is the Colorado study. Colorado State University at Pueblo is doing a lot of research into cannabis. And in fact, I've been out there twice. They have an annual cannabis research conference, which is very informative. So they're looking at the inflammation and inflammatory factors that are the cause of dementia, and they're trying to see if different cannabinoids can work on that inflammation and minimize that inflammation. And again, we can talk about it more, but I think it's just there is a lot of data out there that I think is really impressive. Okay, we can go on to the next. So I have 2 case reports. Again, I could talk about many others, but I just chose these 2. These are patients. I've been seeing patients at a place, Inspire, which is very open. I have to say, Inspire, I've been seeing patients there for about 2 years, and the staff is very supportive of cannabis. When people come in, new, not just patients, but people who are living there who they think would benefit from cannabis, they contact me and I see them. And I will mention this briefly and talk about it in a minute, but so many of the other senior living facilities and memory care facilities across the city and the state are very resistant. And I'm sure there are all kinds of reasons for it, but I find it very frustrating because we are having so much success at Inspire. And I feel badly because I know that there is a vast amount of other patients across the city and the state who would really benefit from cannabis. And I am somewhat frustrated, and I'm just sharing that we're not able to get into these other facilities. Anyway, this is a woman. She's a retired physician, very successful physician up in Boston, who, when I saw her, was agitated, really not interactive at all, had lost a tremendous amount of weight. She was biting the staff. It's now a year plus later. I'm in touch with her family often. They are so happy with her. She's on this regimen, and She's interactive. She's gaining weight. She's pleasant. It's just such a lovely thing to see in her, the change in her. And then I can show you the next one. This is an even older woman. This is not her, obviously, who, when I saw her initially, was non-interactive at all, very depressed and agitated, sometimes very aggressive. It's now 2 years later, and the family again is so happy because with the cannabis regimen that we have her on, she's much more interactive, not depressed, and it's just really gratifying to see these kind of results. Okay, next. So this really is a summary, and I don't have to go through all of these, but this is really what I've been seeing. And I'm actually working with two other physicians, Lynn West, who is up in northern Westchester, and she also sees patients in in Connecticut, and a doctor in Los Angeles. And these are the things that we're observing in our patients. So it's very gratifying for us to be able to interact with the patients and get these kinds of positive behavioral changes. Okay, the next. So Caring Kind is with me, with Northwell, and with Etain, which is the dispensary that I'm mostly working with, are trying to do a longitudinal study looking at the behavioral benefits of cannabis. And the study has not happened yet. Again, Schedule 1, it's difficult to get the IRB to approve it, but we're trying. I mean, the people at Northwell um, I'm working with Edith Burns, who's the head of geriatric research there. We are trying to make something happen. And I know the Caring Kind will let people know as soon as it is actually up and running. But in the meantime, I would say that if, based on all that I've been saying today, that you folks know patients, know people that you think would benefit, please contact us. My next slide will show you how to contact us. Um, we're seeing patients. We do home visits, we do telemedicine, and we're really happy and eager to be involved with as many patients as possible to get them the benefits of cannabis. And I think that may be, what's the next slide? Yep. So again, I wanted to thank everybody at Caring Kind, and I wanted to thank Lauren for helping me with this. And I'm happy to answer questions.
Great. There was actually a question in the chat um, early on. Um, Elizabeth Katz had said if she was starting to read review articles on how cannabis can affect the heart. Can you please comment on what the current research has found?
I I have not seen, I don't know if those are negative studies. When you take a cannabis product, you can get some palpitations transiently and an elevation in blood pressure, but it's transient. And its effect on the heart per se, I don't know studies. I'd like to be shown the studies. Um, my concern is that some of the blood thinners that patients are on there can be interactions, as I was saying, with the metabolism of those products. But I have not seen significant studies showing deleterious effects from cannabis.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead. Please do.
So, hi, my name is Jennifer. My husband is 84 and has what can best be described as Alzheimer's. Nobody can really diagnose it. They all pretend to, but they don't really know. He's been on antipsychotics. He's been on Valium for sleep. He's been on a lot of different things. I like a lot of what you're saying, but my question is, one of the comments you made about antipsychotics for dementia, but yet you talk about how great cannabis is for um, for antipsychotic. So it seems to not jive with what's happening with.
Wait, I'm confused. Are you asking about the fact that I
So
said,
you talked about you. I believe what you said was that one of that when starting a regime, if you were going to start a regime, start slow, whatever. I apologize
Mhm,
for the dog.
that's
You
okay.
say don't take cannabis if you have psychotic episodes, which I find very confusing when every doctor that he goes to offers him for sleep disruption. He's not aggressive. Of antipsychotics. We've been on every one of them. He does sleep, but the next day he's a nightmare. So we've taken him off of everything. We give him melatonin to sleep, and I have a nighttime nurse that's up with him all night long. So I don't get the
No, I understand what you're asking.
okay.
And I think the confusion is that what I was saying was that people who have a predisposition to develop like schizophrenia or other psychotic behavior, I would be very cautious in getting them started on cannabis. But when we're talking about what's going on with your husband, I think he's being given those antipsychotics because of his aggressive behavior. And
No, really, literally for sleep. You ask for sleep
okay,
medicine, they give you Seroquel. I mean, and then you look up Seroquel and it's like, oh, it's an antipsychotic. The medical community, as you are well informed, is not attuned to finding a middle ground. They throw you into Valium, they throw you into Seroquel, they throw you into something to help him sleep. Anyway, they're all gauged as antidepressants or antipsychotics. Anyway, that was my only question. And
right. But
then
if I may, I think what I'm trying to say is that in the situation, first of all, having been an ER doctor for 30 years, I hate those medicines,
yeah,
Haldol and Seroquel and the benzos. They have such a high abuse potential. They also, with patients, I don't know what they're doing with your husband, but they knock them down. They make them not interactive. They're really not. They're not doing anything to bring out any positive
right.
interactive behavior. And what I'm saying is that using cannabis instead is very helpful. It's used a lot in depression. It's used for anxiety. So I'm recommending substituting it for the antipsychotic medicine because it
Okay.
does that make sense?
Yeah, no, there was just a flag that came up when you said don't take it if you're, psychotic, and which I found confusing when all the doctors give you antipsychotics.
Right, because they have nothing else to give. And
Right, they have nothing else to give. And so then I'm sorry to burden everybody else with the second question, but how do you explain I know you talk a lot about the benefits, but there are many brain autopsies, if you're lucky enough to have a brain autopsy, that show none of the clinical things that appear with some Alzheimer's patients, like plaque, like frontal lobe deterioration, like all that kind of stuff. So they have there's so many different elements to Alzheimer's. I'm not sure what I mean, I know dementia is an umbrella, and I'm assuming my husband has Alzheimer's just by behavioral um connecting the dots. And so I just is there, a clinical reason for dementia that you need to make to try all this stuff out?
to
We've
try
tried we've
cannabis.
tried CBD. Somebody said CBN is calmer. I, I just want him to sleep and eat a row of Oreos and be happy. That's what I used to do when I smoked pot. But I don't, today's day and age is very different. How do you
I
Like
think that
just what part of it's going to help. And then the other thing, and then I'm going to shut up, is the when I give him things like that under the tongue, we have some oils we've been giving him that have CBD in them, CBD oils. It's great. It does help him sleep, but the next day he's dumbed down. He's much more unstable. It's hard for him to sort of come back to his previous
baseline.
um at least physical abilities of walking. So it anyway, that's it.
So, all right.
No.
So what I would say is I think of the dementias, I think there are a multitude of processes that occur that can lead ultimately to the behavior that we call dementia. I showed all those etiologies that, that are may or may not really exhibit something on a brain biopsy, but in many ways, the destruction of the neurons or the impairment of neuronal transmission is what's happening. And I think that cannabis can really help prevent or mitigate a lot of those processes. I don't know exactly why somebody would have a biopsy who clearly had dementia and there would be no evidence of anything, but it's not an exact science. Um, and in terms of the CBD, I think the term titration, I think is really important. You may need to be doing a lower dose of the CBD. I think you need to find, as I mentioned, his sweet spot with the CBD or whatever products you wind up using that will hopefully help his sleep, but allow him to wake up in the morning. Everybody has a different response, but I think I would do a lower dose and see if that works.
Okay, we have a number of questions in chat. One is any evidence that cannabis can reduce insoluble beta amyloid deposits?
Well, I think I mentioned that CBD can work on the amyloid. So yes, again, I don't know that I can refer to specific studies, but in all the things I've read, it appears that it really can work on the amyloid.
Do you make house calls to Staten Island?
I would.
Okay, great. You can put your contact information at the end. Um, how is THC CBD dosage prescribed is it prescribed on an individual basis? What factors are taken into account?
Right. I mean, and this is one of the things that's one day I think we'll be able to look at somebody and go, oh, these are your genetics. You should be using high THC, low speed, this, that. Yeah. We're not there yet. I have to say, there's a certain amount of trial and error. And, I go back to start low and go slow. Generally, though, in dementia, we're using a higher CBD ratio to THC ratio. In some people, a 1-to-1 ratio. But, again, I would talk to people individually about it. And I'm working with Etain, with Sang Choi, who is the head pharmacist there, who I think I'd embarrass her, but I think she's brilliant and very experienced. And we see our patients, just so you know, also, uh, in the last couple of weeks, I had just seen 2 new patients and we got them started. And we've had follow-ups where Sang and I will talk with the family and say, oh, well, this is not happening or that is happening. Well, let's try this. I mean, there's going to be a certain amount of trial and error. So, but we work together. I think it's really important because we can't absolutely predict which ratios and which products are going to work the best.
And how can I start a conversation with my loved one's doctor about this?
um, I'm happy to talk to any doctors about it, because, I think there's a lot of evidence out there and I'm happy to talk to them. But you could also tell them what you just saw and let them go to my website also, or let them go to PubMed. There's a lot of information out there. But again, I am happy. I really enjoy talking to my medical colleagues. I think information and education is really very, very important. It's one of the, just as a side note, it's one of the things that I'm most upset about with New York State. They have not done anything to really educate the public. And we have a lot of patients who have stopped coming to us. They're now going to the adult use places because why should they, why do they need a doctor? Why do they need a pharmacist? So I think education is the thing. And I'm happy to talk to any physicians, nurse practitioners, PAs about this.
If someone is taking antipsychotic medication over an extended period of time, will THC still help manage behaviors?
It certainly could. Absolutely. Again, this is something that I'd work with the patient and the pharmacist and figure out what ratios and what amounts to use in that given situation.
The person who wrote about the effects on cannabis and the heart, it was actually, she'd seen it on NBC segment on risks of marijuana and THC, dated November 18th, 2023.
Oh, okay. Well, I will look. Thank you.
Is OF not recommended for dementia patients, and is it necessary to have a negative impact? Is it necessarily having a negative impact on condition? Zoloft.
I mean, as we know, many dementia patients are on it. So I'm not sure the question, what the question is.
And what is your preferred way to take THC? Edibles, sublingual drops, vape, or smoke?
Great question. There are a variety of ways of taking it. I think of them in two different camps. One are the fast-acting products, and I should have mentioned this before, whether they be vapes or drops or sprays, which will come on in anywhere from 5 minutes to 20 minutes and last for a couple of hours. And then the slower acting products, which have to be digested, whether they be gummies or powders or capsules, take an hour or so to come on, but can last for 8 hours or so. And I think generally in chronic conditions, to me, the mainstay of treatment should be the long-acting products. I think the shorter-acting products are good for breakthrough symptoms. If somebody became acutely agitated, for example, a vape or drops might be very helpful for calming them down. But I think the mainstay and what we're using are generally either gummies or drops. And a lot of it also has to do with what patients will take, what they're willing to take. The powders are often good because you can mix them in coffee or whatever. They're not going to really have a taste. Some people like the gummies because they're sweet. They like sweets. So it's on an individual kind of basis. But I think there are two main categories, the long acting and the shorter acting.
Can individuals in assisted living facilities or those who are in hospitals, in a hospital, take this in the at either respective facility?
It depends on the facility. I know the Northwell hospitals are very amenable to this. There's been an issue and a controversy at so many other hospitals. And as I mentioned, at adult, I've had a lot of problems with patients who I've seen at adult living facilities where if they have a procedure in place and they acknowledge it, then that's very easy to do. But in a lot of other places, they're afraid, and if they're getting Medicare funds, federal funds, because it's a Schedule I narcotic, I think I think that's been one of the worst things that's prevented so much of this from spreading out into more facilities is that people are afraid they're gonna lose their Medicare funding.
Is there a difference in recreational use dispensaries versus medicinal use dispensaries?
Absolutely. The recreational are going to be doing a lot more high THC products. They may have more variations in terms of the different strains, because I think people who are going to the rec places are often cognizant or become cognizant of the different strains and what they're looking for in terms of getting high or whatever. But again, there won't be a pharmacist there who's going to be able to really help them with their products. And I think a lot of them, because CBD is not psychoactive, my understanding is that they're not going to have very high CBD ratios. Bruce, do you know? Have you about that? If you can you unmute him?
Yeah, I just unmuted. I have not seen like a one-to-one in any of the rec places. No, they're not serious about that kind of variety.
They're really more about the THC.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they're not going to have a high CBD product either, because
And they're really into selling all of the strains and you know, they're not they're not looking carefully at that aspect, at the medical aspect. They should, and I'm
right.
sure there are products out there that do that would fit that mold, but they're looking for high.
Yeah, they're not obligated by the state to do that. So I think that's a major difference. Thanks, Bruce.
Thank you. And how long does it take to figure out the right dose? And is there additional risk that someone older faces with using cannabis?
Yeah, well, so as I mentioned, it's so variable. I have another patient at Inspire, um, who had horrible anxiety and had a major alcohol problem. She was drinking 2 bottles of wine a day when I saw her. With Sang, we started her on a 1-to-1 capsule twice a day. Within a day, her anxiety was evaporating. She now, and we're talking about probably 8 months later, she may have 1 glass of wine at dinner a night. So that to me is one edge of the spectrum of someone who just it really worked. Other people, it can take weeks. And what I've seen with my patients, the patients who really do the best are the ones who have taken notes. I think it's really important to take notes because it is going to be what you get from a medical dispensary is going to be precise and consistent. So if you take product X and you say, oh, okay, it did these things for me, every time you take that product, you're going to have the same effects. And the patients, again, who really do well are the ones who take notes, who gradually are able to integrate it into their lives, find the sweet spots, because that's really what it is, getting a sweet spot or more than one sweet spot. But it's hard to predict. And what was the second part of that?
Is there any additional risk that someone older faces using cannabis?
No, absolutely. I mean, our metabolism slows down as we get older. And so there certainly is an increased risk. Again, that's why you want to start low and go slow and gradually work your way up. So it's something to consider. And we all think about that when we're seeing elderly patients.
Anybody else have a question? I think we can get my one done here at the bottom. How much does it cost?
Excellent question. It can cost, I would say, on the low side, $60 to $70 a month, up to hundreds, really depending. I always tell people to get like a week or two supply oftentimes to get started, just so they know, so they haven't spent a lot of money and they can really get a sense of how things are working or not working. But I'd say average $150 a month, more or less, up to 200 probably.
Okay.
And it's not covered by insurance, obviously.
And taking care of someone who grew up in the reefer madness era, such as when cannabis propaganda was the norm, how can I introduce medical cannabis as a possible product to use and help alleviate someone with memory loss symptoms?
So how does one get over
Yeah.
the stereotypical thinking about it.
Mhm.
Hopefully I've given some enough or a significant amount of information about it. But again, I'm happy. I enjoy what I do. I enjoy talking to people. I enjoy educating people. So I'm available to talk to people. And go to my website. There's a lot of information there about cannabis and how beneficial it is.
Is there a group in Connecticut that you could recommend similar to yours in New York?
No, I would just recommend Lynn, Dr. West, you know, because she has a Connecticut license and she is seeing patients there.
Mhm. Great. Anybody else have any questions? Everyone's saying thank you, thank you. Lauren, can you put Lynn's contact information in there and then chat, please?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, I'll go ahead and do that.
Thank you.
This one is pretty high up here, almost full, but not used
And I
yet.
think I mentioned, I also work with a nurse who's very, very experienced. She's out in Sag Harbor, Sarah Hallwile. She's part of Cannabis Doctors. So she's happy to see patients as well out in that area.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Weinberg. Always interesting to talk to you.
I hope it was informative and provocative.
Very
And
informative.
yeah, and please contact me, reach out to me. You know, I'm happy to see patients. It's, you know, after all my years as an ER doc, this is so much more gratifying in so many ways. So I'm happy to be, you know, see people.
Someone's asking, what's the range for a medical consultation to determine appropriateness for treatment?
Good question. We actually use a sliding scale based on income, because, you know, that's another thing I should mention. I don't want my fees to prevent people from being able to access this. So, I mean, I have some patients that you know, I'd rather have them get medical cannabis than go back out on the street where they've been using it, and, you know, $25 I've done it for. But, you know, it's a sliding scale. And Lauren, who is on the call, will, you know, is always available to talk to people about that.
Great. Well, if we have no further questions, I'm going to thank you very much, everyone, for being here, for attending. Monday night educational meetings are always informative. I encourage you to go on our website, caringkind.nyc.org. Take a look at what other educational offerings that we have upcoming. Every first Monday of every month, we do offer educational webinars. Thank you, Dr. Weinberg, for being here tonight and leading this very informative webinar tonight on cannabis and dementia. Keep us updated on anything new that's happening in the field. We certainly will have you back. This is an emerging area of research, and anything that can help those living with a memory loss diagnosis and their family and care partners, we're always interested in learning about.
I'm happy to come back whenever you like.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle.
Right. Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Good night, Michelle.
Good night, Elizabeth.